Perhaps the most famous thing that ever has come out of Switzerland is this, milk chocolate. And this is 400 grams, nearly a pound. Lasts me about 2 days. It was invented in Switzerland by Daniel Peter in 1875. He lived in Vevey along the shore of Lake Geneva. And what he did was used Henri Nestlé's condensed milk to mix with chocolate to make milk chocolate. Up until then, the normal milk was too runny and didn't mix very well with the cocoa butter. But he changed the world and changed a lot of lives, including mine, by inventing milk chocolate. Another great invention came along 16 years later in 1891 by Carl Elsner, and he revolutionized the penknife and developed what we now know as the Swiss Army knife, or the Sackmesser, as it's known by the Swiss Germans. Of course, penknives have been around for a while before he came along, but what he did was made the internal workings much thinner and much smaller, so that you've got this, the typical Swiss Army knife. The one that Swiss soldiers use these days is much larger and green and doesn't have the corkscrew. This is actually a Swiss officer's knife, which was patented in 1897 and is the typical red knife that we know and love today. And I made this one myself. I went to the Victorinox factory in Schwyz, which was where Carl Elsner lived, and got a chance to make my own knife. It took me about 5 minutes. It takes the workers on the production line about 45 seconds to put this together. Then the next Swiss invention, which probably you didn't even know was Swiss, is the stock cube or bouillon cube. This was invented in Switzerland in 1908 by Julius Maggi, half Swiss, half Italian man living over in the eastern side of Switzerland. Knorr came along 4 years later in 1912 with their own stock cube, but this is the original. Maggi, of course, is now owned by Nestle. And another thing that chefs couldn't live without, aluminium foil. Sounds great. In English, well, in British English, we still usually call it tin foil because it was originally made from tin. But in 1910, Dr. Lauber, Neher and Company developed a process for rolling aluminium into very, very thin sheets, and aluminium foil was born. Perhaps the most useful Swiss invention for us personally, if you're not in the kitchen and you don't like chocolate, is this great thing, electric toothbrush. The original one was called a Broxident, and it was invented in Geneva by a man with the wonderful name of Dr. Philip Guy Woog. And he invented the toothbrush, the rotating, oscillating electric toothbrush in 1954. The original one you had to use while still plugged in, so you had to be quite close to the wall, I guess, to clean your teeth. And then, of course, comes my favourite Swiss invention of all time, not because it's particularly lovely, but because it's very useful and it has such a great name. This is the WC-Ente, or toilet duck as it's known in English. You wouldn't believe how this transforms, cleaning the smallest room in the house, but it was invented in Switzerland in a little village called Diccon, I think it is, yes, Diccon, near Zurich in 1980 by Walter Düring. And it went on to be copied all around the world and be translated into every language and used to clean toilets everywhere. I think what this shows, apart from chocolate and penknives, which are so famous for being Swiss, the other things you would never know that they were invented by Swiss people. And that's very typical for a lot of Swiss inventions, Swiss products and Swiss people. They don't shout about themselves. It's all quite modest. Switzerland is a land of small poppies rather than tall poppies. Tall poppies get cut down very quickly. So it's much easier to invent something and then just let it go out into the world and make a fortune for you without it being very noticeably your name on it or a Swiss name on it. And of course, the one big product that Switzerland is most famous for is this, Swiss watches. This one doesn't cost 5,000 francs and isn't a Rolex, by the way. But of course, the Swiss didn't invent them. They just make them very well, market them very well, and they're possibly the world leader in watches. But that's something they are famous for, and that's something they are proud and happy to tell the world that they do a really good job.